what is minoritarianism? And this question of who is the elite, it's something that I receive frequently, so it's not something that's entirely clear. Who is the elite when we talk about the elite? Well, first of all, it's important to understand through a tripartite class analysis that there is no one elite. It's not simply that bankers rule the world. That's an oversimplification. Now, it might be the case that bankers have undue influence, or they're overrepresented, or they're more powerful than the other elites, but they're basically financial elites, military elites, and what I call media elites. But in previous times, instead of the media, instead of MAGA, now it's Microsoft, Apple, Google, and Amazon. Instead of the big tech companies and the media, and before the age of television and before the age of radio, we still had media, but the media was of a more primitive form. It was of a more interpersonal form. Media was your church. It was your religion, your tradition, your mythos. So that's given to you by the priest, by the bard, by the church. And we can go back even farther and say that media ultimately is about the power of language and logos and the ability of a myth. It creates pathos and ethos. It tells you what is right, what is wrong. It tells you what you should strive towards, right? It says you should be like this and not like that. You should be like Achilles. So a myth tells you what you should or shouldn't be. A myth says, don't be weak, be strong. A myth says, be pious, don't be sinful. Implicitly, this is what myths are about. Myths are instruction manuals on how to behave, how to act. They moralize. Some of the earlier myths of, say Zeus, about he's going around and he's, having his way with the women of the earth. Some of these myths might take some deeper encoding. There might be deeper metaphors within the myths than is immediately apparent. But ultimately, all myths have some kind of transmission of something deeper than merely like an algebraic calculation. That is, it's, there's some kind of imperative hidden within the declaration of the myth. When you say, and then Achilles rode off to battle, you're not simply stating a historical fact. You're actually implicitly saying you should be like Achilles, or maybe Achilles is doing something foolish, and so implicitly you're saying don't be like Achilles. But within all these myths, there's something hidden, encoded there. And again, some of it's more esoteric. Why would they talk about Zeus having his way with the women of the earth, and this sort of mythology, these dreams? Ultimately, when you dream at night, you are conjuring myths. You're conjuring magical, mystical events. When you have a dream that you're in a cave and you're talking to a man with the head of a bear, and, just weird stuff is going on. A dream, in a way, is a myth, but does your dream become repeated? Does it become a song? Does it become a legend? Well, not unless there is some kind of deeper, broader cultural meaning, unless it has a broader significance to the recipients of that myth and to the propagators of that myth. So if we watch Star Wars together and you say, well, Star Wars is a good movie, it's a good movie not just because it has good special effects, but it's a good movie because it's a myth that somehow appeals to you as an audience member watching that myth. And the reason why it appeals to you is because it taps into a broader mythic structure that you have in your mind. So when you say, I like Star Wars, you're basically saying, I like the moral code, or I like the moralizing implications of Star Wars, and they appeal to that moral code which has already been instilled within me. Now, you can say that some people have like a genetic basis toward one moral code or another. You could say that. I'm not really opposed to that. But at the end of the day, when we talk about environment versus genetics, morality is a form of language. Morality, we're not born with language. No one is born speaking German or French or English or Russian or Chinese or Japanese or Spanish or Igbo or Swahili. No one is born speaking a language. Everyone learns their language. Now, morality, you can teach people different forms of morality. You can teach people to behave sadistically, like with a dog. You can beat a dog and make the dog violent. Myth is a little more complicated than just whether you're a good or a bad person. Myth is a little more complicated than whether you're altruistic or sadistic. Myth talks about, your relation to gender and sexuality, and your relation to violence in the abstract, and your relation to conflict and war, your relation to competition. Myth encodes, behavior about, how you perceive different castes of society, different classes of society. How do you regard the different aspects? So the myth can be a myth, a class myth, like the Norse have the myth of the thrall and the carl and the jarl. The Hindus have the myth of the Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya. What other myths? We have like the Arthurian myth. The Arthurian myth features King Arthur, but then you also have the wizard Merlin. Wizard Merlin, and in the background you have the Holy Grail, which is this grail of Christ. It's the cup that Christ drank of before his death, and it's the first cup of the eternal communion, where the communion transubstantiation from the wine and the bread into the blood and the body. And the Holy Grail was the first time that ever happened, so it's a pretty important grail. So there's a Christian aspect, and then there's also Merlin. He has this kind of alchemical, magical, mystical aspect to him, which is interesting, that you kind of have both of those at the same time. And then King Arthur. I don't know if there's a merchant class in the Arthurian legend. Maybe who is the enemy? It's not Gargamel. It's not the Smurfs. I'm trying to think. Well, the Smurfs is another myth, right? But you have some form of enemy. It's like Marduk, or no, not Marduk. That's Babylonia. I'm trying to think of what the myth is, or the enemy of King Arthur is. But you've got the Knights of the Round Table, and they each have their own, like Sir Gawain and Sir Godwin and all these different knights, and they're running about ancient Wales doing their Welsh things. So we could get deep into that myth, talk about all the important, and we can talk about the Faustian element of that myth. So the myth encourages Faustian behavior. You might have a mathematical predisposition, but you still have to be taught the basics of math. You still have to be taught the symbols and signs, and so on and so forth. Now, at some point back in our history, someone came up with those symbols and signs. And the people who came up with the symbols and signs of mathematics, we could say the Arabs who figured out algebra, the Greeks who figured out geometry, and also the Hindus made a lot of advances. The Persians Persian mathematicians were very important in the ancient world. So the Babylonians came up with certain mathematical, you start off with something like the calendar because astrology is important. So you're looking at the calendar to figure out what stars are going to be in what position at what time. So you've got all these ancient mathematicians, and those individuals who were able to make advances in the realm of mathematics, those individuals would be geniuses, in my opinion. They had the creative genius not merely to replicate mathematics or to apply certain principles of mathematics, but they were ones who actually discovered the principles in the first place. And that, to me, is creative genius. That's the ability to discover something new for the first time. Now, maybe again, it's not the first time in the universe, but it's the first time for your cultural group, so no one taught it to you. You just had to know it. So that's what genius is, and I think there are not just geniuses in mathematics, but there are geniuses in the world of culture. There are geniuses in the arts. There are geniuses in mythology, geniuses in storytelling, geniuses in religion. I mean, when you look at people like these prophets of history, the Jewish prophets, Joseph Smith, whoever came up with Scientology, I forget the guy's name, but you have these people where the success of their religion basically correlates with the strength of their prophetic genius. So it's not just mathematics where we have geniuses all over. And it's geniuses who are creative. It's geniuses who discover new forms and new transmutations, who build off earlier forms. They're not merely, rehashing something. They're not just getting the correct answers on a test, but they're discovering answers to questions which were not even asked, or they're formulating questions and answering them in a way that no one has done before. That's what genius is. So there are certain cultural geniuses. There are certain people who have the genius to be able to say, okay, here's a new religion. I don't have that genius. You don't have that genius. We don't have the ability to form a new religion. We basically have to look at the geniuses of the past and say, okay, well, they came up with something that fits our purposes, or that appeals to us, or that we think is true, whatever test you're using to choose religion. Probably, the truth seeker would say we should choose the religion which is true. Well, then we kind of get into the problem of what is truth, and then it's almost like that philosophy. Then you're getting into philosophy, and the question is how do you? I guess that's epistemology for you. A thorny, there's epistemologists and then there's phenomenologists. And I think I've been more of a phenomenologist than an epistemologist at the end of the day. And I guess to me that relates to the division between the rationalist and empiricist. The rationalist says inherently there are these innate ideas before we're born that we know, so we know that God is real, or this religion is true because it's based on these principles which are eternal and universal. Whereas the phenomenologist is an empiricist. He says, okay, well, we don't really have any starting point other than our environment and what's around us. And okay, well, we have this, and this. All right, well, based on this Umwelt, based on this field of perception and this phenomenon, we can say that this is going to be the right religion, this is going to be the right course of action. I guess it becomes difficult, to be a pure phenomenologist, because then the question is, what is actually going on? No one seems to know what the heck is going on. Are we living in a time of rising nationalism? Are we experiencing a religious revival? Is Christianity going to take over? Is Islam going to take over? Is Judaism going to take over? What is on the rise? So people can't even agree on the phenomena that are happening, because to say this is an empirical question, well, maybe on some level it is, but the theories which we use to perceive the data that's going on in the world, to perceive what's important, what should we be focused on, what are the key indicators of what the future is going to look like, we sort of have to, it's like a priori versus a posteriori knowledge. Our theory of what's going on is deeply related to what we perceive is going on. So if we have a theory that what's going on is nationalism is rising, then everywhere we're going to see nationalism rising. Aha! Confirmation bias. I had a theory, and so as a result, I can look around and I can see all the confirmations of my theory. But if you had a different theory, you would see a different form of confirmation. So when we ask this question of which religion to choose, you sort of find yourself in a quandary where it's like, okay, well, in the process of choosing a religion, you're already going to be operating on certain theories. And so in some way, those theories represent a deeper religion. If a religion is a theory of the world, if it's a myth, if it's instruction on how to behave, how to act, how to think, then when we consider the question of how do we choose a religion, well, then I don't want to say it's necessarily deterministic, although I do tend to probably lean in that direction to an extent. But in terms of, at least in sociological reality, maybe for electrons they have free will, but as far as social trends, I'm kind of a determinist. But we take a look at some of these things. We take a look at religion, and it's like the question of how to choose which religion is best. How do we determine which religion is best? We kind of have to use a meta-religion in order to do that, right? We have to say, okay, well, I want my religion to be true. All right, well, how do we figure out what is truth? We're going to use some epistemological theory. So in a sense, your epistemological theory of truth is your meta-religion that determines which religion you're going to choose. So in a sense, in the question, what religion should we choose, there's already a presumption that we have a meta-religion which is capable of directing us toward which religion we should follow. You could call that meta-religion your philosophy. A lot of people have a philosophy that they don't even know exists. They just think it's obvious or common sense or whatever, but nonetheless it's a philosophy, or we could say it's a metaphysics. It is the physics of non-physical objects, of ideas. How do ideas work? How do we prove something is true? You're basically taking the word truth, calling it a quality, and then applying it to abstract ideas as objects. So it is you could say philosophy is metaphysics. What is your metaphysics? Your metaphysics determines what religion you're going to choose. Now, if you already have a religion, you don't have to deal with this problem. But if you do not have a religion, then you have to ask yourself, what is my metaphysics? What is my philosophy? If you don't ask yourself that question, then you're just going to be blindly guided into religion. If you should choose, if you wake up one day and you say, I need religion. Now, if you don't ask that question, then you do have a religion, you just don't know what it is. Or you say, I don't have religion, I'm an atheist. And I would make the argument that atheism is a form of religion. Religion is a system of belief about the world. It's a system of mythology. We can't directly interact with the world. We can't directly experience the world. We need mythology. We cannot operate as human beings without mythology. There's no escape from it. Mythology is simply a higher form of language. whereas language deals directly with reference, subjects, objects that are directly experienceable. So we can talk about, I sit in the chair. Well, I know what I am, or I have some kind of working definition of me. It's my body, my person. How deeply I scrutinize, that's another question, but I've got me, and I've got the chair. We know what a chair looks like, and sitting, we know what that looks like. I bend my knees, and I rest my bottom on that chair. So I sit in the chair, that's your language. But then you've got sort of this meta-language of mythology, which talks about the self in relation to society, the self in relation to God, the society in relation to other societies, the different subparts of societies, the relation of the demos to the elite, the relation of the rulers to the ruled. Mythology tells us all these things. So, in order to figure out what our mythology is, we have to start scrutinizing these big concepts to figure out what our religion is. And it's an interesting problem. It's an interesting, again, if you're a rationalist, then you believe that implicitly you know who God is. And I think there is like a rationalism in Christianity where it's like God is the seed of an idea and he exists inside your mind, and if you just search deep enough inside yourself, you're going to find God, and specifically you're going to find the Christian God. Now the problem with this is that Christianity is to a large extent dependent on the Bible. And you can't know what the Bible says before you read the Bible, unless you believe that, the revealed truth of the Bible can be whispered in your ear by God or something. But there is a kind of empirical aspect where it's like you have to read the Bible. If you don't read the Bible, you can't be a Christian, or if you don't understand the message of the Bible. And the history of the Bible is that Christianity is kind of a meta-myth. Christianity says that before Christianity there was Judaism, and then after Christ came, he changed the mythic structure of Judaism to become Christianity, which means that implicit within Christianity is a meta-myth. Christianity is a meta-myth because it doesn't simply state a myth, but it says that this myth is an evolution out of a previous myth. That the previous myth was a good myth for its time and place, but that myth ran its course, and now it's time for a new myth. So Christianity is meta-mythological, which is really interesting and cool, because we also find ourselves in a meta-mythological situation when we ask the question, what religion should we join? What religion should we be a part of? That's a meta-mythological question, not a mythological question. So Christianity as a meta-mythological religion, in a sense, points us toward this idea of choosing our religion rather than simply inheriting the truth. Well, of course, Zeus is the god, and of course, the myths about him are true. Everybody knows that. They're just true. There is something like, maybe you could say there's something empirical about that you wouldn't know about Zeus if someone hadn't told you about Zeus. But prior to that, in the schizophrenia of early Greek religion, the prophet said, I can hear from the muses. The muses tell me what is true and what is not true about the gods. The gods are speaking to me. So that is direct divine revelation without mediation. Direct truth spoken into your ear without any need for scrutiny or criticizing or skepticism. It's just direct revelation. Now, I don't have a direct revelation for you. I can't tell you that God spoke in my ear and he told me this religion was best, and that's why I believe this religion is the best religion. So I don't have that option. all that we can do in a meta-mythological way is say, well, this prophet says this, and this prophet says that, and this prophet seems to be like he's saying something that's more true than the other prophets. So we are in this very post-Christian meta-mythological state, and you do have to kind of give Christianity credit, right? So when we talk about meta-mythology, we are using some kind of meta-mythology in order to discern one mythology from another. And that is our starting point. That is our basic starting point. Like, we can't go back to paganism. We can't go back to a time of direct revelation. We've moved past that psychologically. We don't have the ability to go back to the time when we were a child. We don't have the ability to go back to being a baby or an animal. Like, we can't turn back time. We have to be who we are, and we are meta-mythological. And therefore, in some sense, we are Christian. We cannot escape the meta-mythology of Christianity. Christianity was unique for its time, I believe, and if someone can prove me wrong, I'd love to hear it, but it was unique for its time. Maybe Buddhism shares something with Christianity in this respect, this meta-mythological quality. But we're all Christian. You can't escape Christianity. But when I talk about meta-mythology, I'm not talking about dogma, right? I'm talking about your meta-dogma. I'm talking about the dogma that you use to differentiate one dogma from another. So Christianity is inherently a philosophical religion, which is why it's descended from Pythagoras, because Pythagoras was meta-mythological. Now, Pythagoras didn't have a religion, he had a cult. What's the difference? Well, a cult is elite. A cult has a few people in it, whereas a religion has millions of people. It's for the masses. So Pythagoras didn't have a religion, he had a cult, but his cult was meta-mythological. He didn't believe in the gods. He believed that the gods represent something deeper about the nature of our universe and the metaphysics of our universe. So he was meta-mythological. And we could say that liberalism is, in a sense, meta-mythological. Do you see where I'm going with this? Liberalism is meta-mythological. Liberalism does not have a mythology in itself. Liberalism doesn't say Donald Trump is the king and he's the king because he's descended from the king by the divine right of kings. And so he has the right to order us to do this and that and to declare wars. But then we also have the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church governs the spiritual domain or something like that. Liberalism does not provide us with a mythology directly, although there are many mythologies within liberalism. For instance, the myth that Donald Trump is the Antichrist. That's a myth that millions of people believe in. He's the Antichrist. Other people believe he is a kind of hero, a savior of America, and then other people are somewhat in between. But liberalism allows for this meta-mythological field where we are supposed to be agents who are capable of choosing between different mythologies within a meta-mythological system. So just as Pythagoras was meta-mythological, just as Christianity was meta-mythological, so too is liberalism meta-mythological. Now, I am a meta-mythological person. I don't have a myth for you. I don't have a direct revelation from God, and I also don't have a book that I can point to and say, this book contains all the direct revelations from God. I can't with confidence say that to you. So I am a meta-mythological person living within a post-Christian, or we can say even, I am, therefore, because I am meta-mythological, I'm following in the tradition of Pythagoras, I'm in the tradition of Christianity, and I'm in the tradition of liberalism. And each tradition basically becomes more meta-mythological, because Pythagoras was meta-mythological because he said, look at all these myths. Look at the myths of the Babylonians. Look at the myths of the Hyperboreans. Look at the myths of the Egyptians. Look at the myths of the Greeks. if we compare all these myths, then we have a meta-myth. And then Pythagoras set about describing what that meta-myth was in terms of his myth of the numbers. So the myth of the numbers was a kind of meta-myth, or a metaphysic, Pythagorean metaphysics. We start off with that, where he's comparing different myths and saying, well, if we take all these myths together, then we're going to get to the truth of the matter. Christianity says we have a myth of Judaism. Now we're going to change that myth. We're going to evolve on that myth. And so we have mythic progression. This is not something you really have in paganism. Paganism says the gods are what they are. There's not really mythic progression. Christianity says we had some books. Now we have a new book. It's the New Testament. And it describes and it explains our mythological progression. We had the old law. Now we have the new law. We had the old law, and that, it resulted in death, and now we have Christ. We've come to a point of evolution. So there's something meta-mythological within Christianity. Whereas Pythagoras was a cult leader, and he didn't have a mass religion behind him. He didn't have the masses behind him. What Christ was able to do is he was able to take that meta-mythological aspect in Pythagoreanism, and he was able to spread it amongst the masses, ultimately, through the middle classes, through mechanisms. And then liberalism comes along, coming out of the Christian tradition, and says, let's be even more meta-mythological, and liberalism starts to say, you don't need to be a warrior aristocrat to own land. Anyone can own land. And this basically results in the warrior class and the priest class attacking, the warrior class and the merchant class together attacking the Christian priest class. So you get the emergence of a liberal priest class with people like Voltaire, these atheists, agnostics, Marxists, nationalists. All of these people come out of liberalism. So liberalism is meta-mythological, and we're just getting more and more meta-mythological. Well, what comes next, my friend? Is it postmodernism, which says nothing is true, and we're going to be ironic about everything and kill ourselves? Is that our stopping point? No. Postmodernism was not meta-mythology necessarily. Postmodernism was a kind of depressing, antenatal, I guess you would say it was Europe giving up on itself. Oh, we can't believe anything. Everything is stupid. Everything's evil. Everything's arbitrary. We should just stop having kids. Postmodernism is not our final stopping point, folks. There's something beyond postmodernism. We could say if modernism was the age of totalitarian liberalism, that was totalitarian communism, totalitarian fascism, which are both liberal in origin. Now people are going to dispute that. No, they're not liberal. They are liberal because fascism comes out of nationalism, nationalism comes out of liberalism, communism comes out of classical liberalism, it comes out of the economization of the world. So fascism is basically the democratization of the world, whereas communism is the economization of the world. But they're both fundamentally liberal. Democracy and economy are both deeply united in liberalism. That's democratic economicism is the heart of liberalism. That's what it is, because it's a class struggle, and therefore it's democratic. It's a class struggle against the old aristocracy and against the old priest class. That's the way in which it's democratic, because it wants to destroy class structures. And it's econometric because it wants to destroy the power of the priest and warrior class and elevate the merchant. So they're both fundamentally liberal. But that's a debate. I'm sure people are not satisfied with my short answer. But let's just skip over that and say, if the 20th century was the century of totalitarian liberal ideologies of fascism and communism, then what's the 21st century? Well, it's about going beyond postmodernism. Postmodernism is not actually an affirmation of anything. Postmodernism is not It is not a claim. It is not even a system. It's just rejection, negation, saying no, refusal. I think people who have been watching the channel know where we're going. We're going hypermodernism. Hypermodernism is a type of meta-mythology which goes beyond liberalism. So it's a form of post-liberalism, but it's not a form of liberalism that refutes liberalism. It's a form of liberalism that actually takes liberalism and it takes the meta-mythological aspect of liberalism and it goes beyond where liberalism has gone with another level of meta-mythology. So again, meta-mythology begins with Pythagoras. It then develops further with Christianity. It then develops further with liberalism. And now it's developing further with hypermodernism or hypermodernity. And maybe there's some better word that someone's going to come up with. But I think hypermodernity is where you say, okay, liberalism, okay, I see what you're doing here. I see your meta-mythology. But can we take it a step further? Can we say that liberalism is a mythology of its own? And can we compare other competing liberal mythologies? That's what I do when I compare liberalism to fascism or liberalism to communism. I'm taking the liberal system, I'm fashioning it, or I'm fitting it into a mythology. I'm describing it as a mythology, as a description of the world. And then I'm creating a meta-mythology where I go above and beyond fascism, I go above and beyond liberalism, I go above and beyond communism, and I describe the system which encapsulates these other smaller systems. Now, Dugin claimed to have done this with fourth political theory, but really all that Dugin does is he talks about civilizationalism. He says China should have its civilization, Russia should have a civilization, America can have a civilization, Europe can have a civilization, Russia can have a civilization, South America can have a civilization. So all he does is he takes the nation state and he puts it on the level of civilization. Now there might be something to that. There might be something to that idea. But in itself, it hasn't actually escaped liberalism. It's not actually, so I would describe Alexander Dugin's fourth political theory as an extension of liberalism through nationalism by taking the nation state and transposing that onto the civilization state. And that's all he's done. He hasn't actually escaped liberalism. That's my meta-mythological hypermodern analysis of Alexander Dugin, is he either doesn't know what he's doing, he's either ignorant of the fact that he's a liberal, or alternatively, he knows what he's doing and he's just, making things up to confuse people to try to get, to try to promote Russian imperialism or something like that. He's not an honest guy. So you have, he's either not honest or he's ignorant, one of the two. So what I'm proposing is not civilizationalism strictly. Although in an objective sense, we could say that there is this Western civilization and there is a Chinese civilization, and like Toynbee's model, there is something to that analysis, but it's not something I'm proposing as something anti-liberal. I'm not promoting anti-liberalism. I'm not trying to attack liberalism. I'm trying to go beyond liberalism in a meta-mythological sense. That is, when we compare Pythagoras to Christ to Henry VIII, we see three figures who are going in a meta-mythological direction, and they're increasing the meta-mythologicization. I don't even know what words I'm using anymore. The meta-mythic quality of the system. They're increasing the meta-mythicism. I'm just adding suffixes at random here. They're increasing the meta-mythicism at each step. So I want to take it further. I don't want to attack liberalism. I want to increase the meta-mythicism of liberalism, which brings me into hypermodernism, which is an extension of Pythagoras, Christ, and Henry VIII. Who is its prophet? I don't know, John David Ebert. So we're going more meta-mythic. We're going into a post-liberal mode, but it's not an anti-liberal mode. I'm not opposed to liberalism. I just want to go beyond liberalism. I don't know if I can do that, but we're trying to go beyond liberalism. For me, the political solution is not civilizationalism, although that's going to be part of the context that we play in. But politics is not just describing the field. Politics is advocating for what we should do. And I think we should be minoritarians. That's my political strategy. We should be hyper-modern, meta-mythological minoritarians. And in the context of liberalism, this basically looks like Freemasonry and perennialism. And you've got a lot of groups out there. You've got the Amish, you've got the Jews, you've got the Mormons, you've got different groups out there who are trying their hands at minoritarianism to various degrees of success. I would say the ones that are going to be the least successful are those who disengage from reality and go off on the farm, like the Amish. And you've got the Mormons who are a little more into things. They're into the CIA, they're into the FBI. They've got Romney, they've got presidential candidates. So they've gone a little bit beyond. And then what's going to happen with minoritarianism? What is the best minoritarian strategy? I mean, some people could say Judaism is the best strategy, but then Judaism has like several different component parts and different ideas that branch off. And I mean, if people want to be Jewish, I can't really stop them from being Jewish. Although for people who don't want to be Jewish, like if you're just going to take that as an axiom, like that you can't convert to Judaism, which isn't technically true, but maybe you could say it's true if we take an ethnic view of Judaism, that technically you can't convert to a different ethnicity. So what would you do then? I think it would basically look something like Freemasonry on an esoteric level. I mean, whatever. It's going to be something perennialist, which Freemasonry was, and it's going to be based in Christianity, which Freemasonry was. I mean, the vast majority of Freemasons were Christians. They were not Catholic, of course, but yeah, you've got something like Freemasonry going on, and you know you've got all sorts of lodges, not just Freemasonic, like the Elks Lodge and all kinds of the Jesuits, you could say, were pursuing a minoritarian strategy. So I guess the question is, do you want to try to create your own thing, or are you just going to join an existing structure? You know, creating your own thing, I guess, has the advantage of it's particular to your time, and you can reformulate things to make them exactly as you want them. But if you join an existing structure, then you already have all these resources at your disposal. I mean, think about some of these secret societies. They're not even secret, they're just fraternities, basically. I'm just advocating that people join fraternities, okay? That's basically all I'm asking for. I'm just saying you should join a fraternity. Now, if you look at the field of fraternities and you say, well, I want to create a new fraternity. Well, what's the cost-benefit analysis? The benefit is it's your own special little fraternity exactly the way you want it to be. The cost is you might fail and no one wants to join your fraternity. And so there's a cost-benefit analysis there. I would say instead of just rejecting existing structures entirely, you should basically be looking to co-opt existing structures. So if you join a fraternity, don't be like, fraternities suck, I hate fraternities, I'm an individualist, all of you guys are wrong, I have my own special interpretation of the Bible that's radically different from everyone else's interpretation. I don't find that helpful. I don't recommend that. I think you should look at what is already, unless you think you're a true genius, which I don't think there are many of those anymore. Unless you think you're a true genius and you're going to create a new religion and have some divine revelation from God. I mean, the number of cults that are out there is numerous. You know, there are more cults. Each person has their own cult, right? So I would say just join whatever seems to be the most successful in the world. And the Abrahamic faith seems to have been most successful. And Out of those, the most populous is Christianity between the Catholics and the Protestants. You've also got Islam. And Judaism is not popular, but it never tried to spread. I mean, I guess you could say the moment when Jews tried to evangelize is the moment they became Christians. So Jews are basically just Christians who choose not to evangelize, in a sense. Probably Christians won't like me saying that. No, they're totally different. Okay, well, anyway. That's the situation. That's the field we have. Which team are you going to join up with? It's a question I can't answer for you. But I would say you probably want to go with something based in Abrahamism. If you're going to reject 2,000 years of Abrahamism and say we're going to go back to paganism, I'd say you probably have a problem. You probably aren't actually on a deep psychological, like Freudian level. You're probably not looking to succeed. You're probably just looking to signal how different you are and whatever. So this thing where people are opposed to joining existing structures, it's a problem. I mean, I would say I've laid out, my new beliefs on foreign policy. And basically, I would say you should just join a fraternity, be basically Abrahamic in one way or another, and support American foreign policy, support American imperialism. I mean, that's my perspective. I guess if you're born in China, you're going to have a different perspective. If you're born in Europe, maybe you're going to have a different perspective. But I don't know. Those are sort of the conclusions that I come to. And I guess I'm saying all this because there's a lot of people who are drawn toward nationalism because they're looking at the vast majority of people and they're looking at how decisions are made and they're like, well, this decision, mass immigration isn't good for the people. But mass immigration is great for minoritarians. If you have a minoritarian strategy, the mass immigration helps you because it makes your strategy more important. It makes your strategy more valuable. It would be like saying, let's say you own a gun. Say you own a firearm and you live on an island with a bunch of people and you're the only one with a gun. Do you press a button if you're trying to compete against your neighbors, trying to win power? Do you press a button to let a bunch of wolves onto the island? Because if you let the wolves on the island, then you have the gun and you can shoot the wolves, but no one else can. So that means you monopolize power. In the same way, if you're a smart minoritarian and you bring in a bunch of third world immigrants who mess everything up, then you're going to monopolize power better because you're going to have the minoritarian strategy to navigate that situation. So, mass immigration is not good for the average middle-class person. And when people oppose mass immigration, they're assuming that we as a society are going to return to some kind of majoritarian strategy, which I don't think is the case. It's going to have to be minoritarian. So basically, I'm making an argument for neoconservatism. I'm making an argument to support Israel. You must support Israel. This is what this video is about. So that's the direction we're heading. That's, it's I guess it's a question at the end of the day of, do you want to have some kind of axiomatic principle of I don't know, we must fight, people say we must fight Israel. It's if that's your axiomatic principle, or we must be majoritarian, I think that's usually what it boils down to. We must do what is good for the common man. We must do what is good for the majority. We must do what is good for the middle class. I think that is an ideology that's held by a wide number of people. We got to do what's good. I mean, it's like utilitarianism, basically. We got to do what's good for the majority of people. And I think ultimately that kind of utilitarianism is what undergirds socialism as well as nationalism. This utilitarianism, we have to bring the most good to the greatest number of people. So it's a question of, are you a utilitarian? Do you just believe in bringing the most good to the most number of people? Or are you not a utilitarian? Are you a believer in genius? Are you a believer in history? Are you a believer in art? Because art is not made by the majority for the majority. Art is made by geniuses for other geniuses. Great art is made by great artists in service of a king. Great music, Bach and Beethoven and Vivaldi and Offenbach and Sibelius, maybe not Sibelius, but some of the greats there who established the classical tradition in Europe, Handel, they were not making music for the masses. We know what music for the masses sounds like. It sounds like pop. It sounds like Lady Gaga. It sounds like Billie Eilish. Sounds like the Beatles and Elvis. That's what pop music sounds like. When you take a utilitarian approach toward music, it sounds like trash. And trashy people like it. And maybe I'm a little bit trashy sometimes. Maybe I like pop music sometimes. But that's what it is. Let's just be honest about it. Okay? If you make art for the masses, what does that look like? Porn. I mean, porn is a type of art. It's just art for the masses. What happens when you make art for the upper class, for the aristocrats, for elites, for geniuses? Then you get, Botticelli. Then you get Van Gogh. Then you get some of these great artists of history. When you make a movie for the masses, you get Transformers. When you make a movie for intellectuals, you get Citizen Kane or something like that, So this is the attack I would make against majoritarian utilitarianism. I would say, if your desire in life is to do the best good for the most number of people, you're a trashy person. You're following a trashy moral code. What's better, in my opinion, is to do the best for the best people, to create works of genius for geniuses, to work and operate at that higher level. So that's how I attack utilitarianism, of socialism, of nationalism, and that is how and I'm kind of joking when I talk about neoconservatism in Israel and stuff like that. That's a more particular debate. Torin McCabe came on and we had that debate and he made some good points. And it's something, unfortunately, that's getting harder and harder for us to hash out and have these discussions and disagreements on YouTube. And that's not my choice. That's Susan for you. But I think that about wraps up our meta-mythological discussion. Thanks for listening, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.